as you might know, the Socialist Health Association is a affiliated body to the Labour Party. It's open to Labour Party members and also non-Labour Party members, so you don't actually have to be a member of the Labour Party to join. It's largely made up with a lot of medical practitioners, ex-medical practitioners, or people who work in medical National Health Administration, and also obviously a lot of us who are actually patients, very grateful patients in NHS. It's the 75th anniversary of the NHS, and it's for me it's the most precious jewel that the Labour movement was able to craft. And the SHA is dedicated to preserving that jewel and to not let it be taken from us by any means, whether that's backdoor or whatever. The jewel of the Labour movement, a thing that was created by the Labour Party, that we actually make sure that that's the #1 priority. And there's no excuse for saying there's not enough money to fund the National Health Service. Of course, the reason I'm saying that is because they say people are living longer. That is the testament to the National Health Service, the fact that we're all living longer. So we have a range of speakers tonight, and I'll introduce first, well, I'm very happy to introduce the local MP for the City of Durham, in which we're sitting, Mary Kelly, who is actually an old friend of the Socialist Health Association. She's been speaking at our meetings since she was a Gateshead councillor on the cabinet, in the Gateshead cabinet with responsibilities for public health. She's often spoken at our NHS meetings, and it's a privilege really to ask her to lead off our evening tonight. So
Okay, I'm small, so it's there, but can you hear me? Okay? Excellent. Well, yes, as Terry said, I'm Mary Kelly Foy, City of Durham MP. It's such a privilege to represent such a wonderful, historic and diverse part of the world. And thanks to the Socialist Health Association for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm really privileged. And I think I want to thank all NHS workers who've been on strike and those who are still to go on strike. You have my full unconditional support and solidarity now and always. Because I know that you're striking for us. You're striking to keep the NHS public. And where's Alex? With Alex on the panel tonight, may I start by saying it's an absolute disgrace that the fat cat train operators and the government are trying to close hundreds of ticket offices. And I know that the RMT will fight for all of those affected and all of the families and all of us who rely on the station staff. And I'll join you in that fight as well as everyone here this evening. So solidarity. And I've got a feeling that there's something going on behind me and I haven't even seen it. Oh, I haven't seen that. Okay, so in 1925, a miner in Wales died of black lung disease after years of inhaling poisonous dust in the coal mines. And as he died, his son held him in his arms and said, "I've got to do something about this. It can't go on like this." And 21 years later, he did do something about it. He led the National Health Service Bill through Parliament, and that was Nye Bevan. And then 75 years ago, the National Health Service was born. And in the decades that followed, mental and physical health was greatly improved throughout the whole country. And for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, working class people had a safety net, a chance to live life in dignity and happiness. And so the NHS isn't just Labour's gift to the world, it's the gift of a former miner to all working class people. Now before, as Terry said, before I became an MP, I was a councillor in Gateshead where I held the portfolio for health and well-being. And one of my main passions was trying to tackle health inequalities. And so it was great for me that my time on the council coincided with Sir Michael Marmot's review in 2010, A Fair Society, Healthy Lives, which I know lots of you here will be familiar with, the health prevention agenda, and where we look at the social determinants of health that affect that's a person's health. I know that the NHS makes up of about 15% of a person's health, but it's actually the conditions you are born in, your job, your education, your income that actually, and your lifestyle that deems whether or not you have a healthy life expectancy. So a couple of the points that Marmot made in that report, that reducing health inequalities is a matter of fairness and social justice, and that health inequalities result from social inequalities. And Marmot made several recommendations. He argued that we need to give children the best start in life, and that we need to strengthen the role and the impact of ill health prevention. But where are we now? Well, in 2020, Marmot spoke of a lost decade. He put together a new report looking to see what had happened in the decade before, and I very much doubt he thought we would be where we are today. But in that decade, public health had stopped improving, a decade where Britain has become more socially and economically unequal. And he said, and I quote, "If the architects of these policies imagined that all of the money had been going to waste, the evidence suggests that they were mistaken." And let's remember that the NHS and the welfare state were born out of austere post-war conditions. And but ministers, I guess, back then prioritised the health of the many rather than the profits of a few. So that the wrong way around. You know what I mean? Yeah.
No, you're right.
But the same can't really be said today. Is definitely it's the profit. They're into just profit, saying that the NHS is going to cost too much, and those fat cats in the private sector who are bit by bit taking over our National Health Service for profit. But the ministers, it can't be said that they weren't told about this, that this crisis would happen. And in 2019, I guess you all know as well, that the United Nations assessed poverty in Britain. And despite us being the 5th largest economy in the world, millions of people, including children, were found to be living in destitution. Food banks, homelessness, rough sleeping were all on the rise. And these are the results of an austerity experiment that are crystal clear, and that's what the United Nations experts said. And the social safety net is being torn apart by austerity. But what's the Tories' response to that? It regretted the overly political tone of the United Nations report. But I think even before the pandemic hit us, the Tories' obsession with austerity had already cost us so much. And I think there may have been over 300,000 excess deaths due to austerity between 2012 and 2019. That is absolutely outrageous. And those people were human beings, who are people's family, their friends and their loved ones. People who may have been with us still today had the government funded a welfare state. And instead, those people are gone. Gone because old Etonians in Whitehall valued some lives over others, and they still do. And I think the next, in terms of the pandemic, the next time you're in London, you may have seen this, you may have not, but please visit the COVID-19 Memorial Ball, where it's full of tiny little red hearts as a remembrance of those people who've died. People have gone down there and put their own heart on, they put pictures of their loved ones on that they died is very, very powerful. But you know, just ask yourself how many of those hearts are there because of the austerity agenda. Because austerity did leave us completely unprepared to fight the pandemic, and it left us with low staffing levels. It left us with dangerously low capacities and a real weak social safety net. And David Cameron and George Osborne and the Tories and the Liberals, remember, who backed them, really owe us all a huge apology for what they've done. But I think as well, the first victims of austerity really didn't have much of a choice, didn't have much of a voice in those days. And if you can remember thinking of those when the Tories changed the welfare state system, thinking of those who were receiving social security, they were, I reckon, the first victims of the cost of living crisis, where that sharp edge of austerity really cut in. People who were severely sanctioned, people like David Clapson, you might remember him in the news. David Clapson, who was the army veteran, someone who'd served his country, but the country certainly didn't serve him. He died with a pile of CVs next to his body, next to his bedside, and because he was unable to pay his bills, he was unable to pay for the energy to keep the fridge on where his insulin was kept. And sadly, he died, and that's due to austerity. And we really can't go on treating people like this. And I know people may think it'll be easy to just accept defeat, accept that we can't change the way things are at the minute, and that we can't build a better society for ourselves and our future generations. But one thing that gives me hope is that, well, our whole Labour movement, and that's why you're here today and this weekend, which is going to be fantastic. And as I said at the start, the NHS workers they're striking for all of us. And I think that's true of all workers, really. They're striking so that our children, and in my case, my new granddaughter, that you may, oh, there she is. That's my first granddaughter, Breda. There she is, just a few weeks old. Where people are striking and fighting for our NHS and better welfare straight, so young ones like my granddaughter can live in a society that is based on need and not want. And I think it's one where we have world-class education, we have a home and a secure job. It's not really too much to ask for, and all of this must be on the foundation of a strong healthcare system and a strong welfare state, so people can just live a life of happiness and dignity. But the Tories are really scared of us all right now. They're scared of the collective power of working class people. And they wouldn't be pursuing the anti-strikes bill if they weren't scared. Because they know when workers are united, they can't be defeated. And that the working class still has the power to change the world, no matter what the media might be telling us, what the government might be telling us. We do have the power to change the world. And I know that the public are behind the NHS workers, the NEU, the train workers, the posties, barristers, we've got everything. The list is endless now of those people who are fed up with austerity, fed up with this government, but together we do have the power to change the world. So let's use this gala, which is the greatest celebration of working class solidarity anywhere in the world, to remember our past struggles and keep up this mighty upsurge of trade unionism. And if we do that, I think we will win. So solidarity, everyone, and have a great day.
Happy that the City of Durham have such a good MP that will stand on bigger lines with us other workers and defend not only the rights for a decent living wage, but the right for a decent living, and that includes being a decent health service too. And speaking about that, I'm very privileged again to invite our next speaker, who is Alex Gordon, who is the RMT president, up to speak. A few days ago, I was in along with other disabled people who I happened to be campaigning with, at Durham railway station, picketing the ticket office at Durham against the closures, because the station staff are so, having station staff, having station vans is so important to elderly and disabled people, and it's great to know that we have a union, like I said, that doesn't just stand for wage demands, but also is prepared to fight for a decent service for everyone. We used to have, obviously we're having the Durham Miners Gala tomorrow, and our NUM used to be the vanguard of the trade union movement. I think they passed that on to the RNT because they are really at the forefront of the fight against the Tories and cuts. So it's a privilege to ask Alex to come up and speak. Alex, come on, please. Thank you.
Yeah, just speak to the mic, as they say. All right, well, I want to just say thank you to Steve for his solidarity. I want to say thank you to Mary Kelly Foy, who's a member of the RMT's parliamentary group of MPs, for the unceasing work they do on behalf of RMT members, and the message that we want to bring to Durham, to the Gala this year, is that we're here for you, and you're here for us. And there's a job of solidarity that needs to be delivered for health workers, for teachers, for civil servants, and for railway workers who are facing the extinction of their industry and their jobs under this Tory government. And I want to say first of all that I'm honoured to speak on behalf of my union, RMT, about bringing solidarity to our NHS from the trade union movement. And I want to say first of all that I'm a member of the Socialist Health Association, have been for a number of years, and I'm obviously proud to tell you that my union have been for a number of years affiliated this year to the Socialist Health Association. It's very important that the SHA seeks the support and involvement of the organised labour movement through affiliation of trade unions at all levels. And it's important for trade unions that we too can demonstrate to our members the enduring relevance of the trade union values embodied in our NHS, such as mutual aid, solidarity and public ownership. On the 75th anniversary of the founding of our NHS, the need for active solidarity with NHS workers and with the NHS founding principles of universal healthcare from cradle to grave, free at the point of need, has never been greater. These principles are, of course, trade union principles that the South Wales Miners Federation enshrined in the Tredegar Park Cottage Hospital, and which were taught to Nye Bevan as a member of its management committee from 1928. And today, we see the response of our government and the wider political elites as we emerge from the greatest health crisis of our lifetimes, the COVID-19 pandemic, by promoting wage cuts designed to make workers pay for the cost of the economic shutdown, and now by calling explicitly for a recession as a necessary corrective to inflation, as the Bank of England governor did last month. They are demonstrating that they reject the principles of universality and mutuality that our NHS is built on. Instead of a 1945 moment under a Labour government, when the political response to wartime economic destruction was construction of a welfare state in Britain and policies values designed to stimulate domestic demand. the post-COVID return to neoliberal normality resembles more closely the policy of coordinated wage cuts and public expenditure that we saw after the First World War, the so-called Geddes Acts. And the absence in Britain of meaningful legal protections for workers against this fire and rehire culture, or fire and replace culture, has meant that workers have faced attempts by employers to issue collective redundancy notices and to re-employ their staff under new and inferior paying conditions. From the 800 P&O ferry workers sacked without notice via a Zoom call on the 17th of March 2022, the St. Patrick's Day massacre, to the 2,300 members of railway staff working in railway ticket office stations who've just been told this week by private train operating companies that make hundreds of millions of pounds of profit each year that they're proposing to close over or up to 1,000 ticket offices across the rail network, and that these ticket office closures are subject to a 21-day, 3-week public consultation. And as well as the need to defend our national collective bargaining agreements through industrial action, by early last year, early 2022, workers in this country were also beginning to face the scourge of rapidly rising inflation, which hasn't been a prominent feature of industrial relations in this country since the late 1980s. Although this received little attention at the time from Britain's media, the key workers who were lauded during the pandemic in the NHS were the first ones to lead the charge against the rising inflation and to demand better paying conditions and indeed to be brought in-house. And I'm referring to the significant strikes by cleaners, porters, security staff and catering staff working for outsourced facility management companies throughout the National Health Service and throughout public transport services and indeed throughout our universities and schools and local authorities. It was these workers, the workers that we were told to clap for in 2021 when they were making sure that our trains, our public transport systems, our hospitals were kept safe for emergency service workers to use. It was these workers who were the first to stand up and demand their rights at work. These low-paid key workers who were subject to highly insecure employment, without contractual rights to sick pay, or in most cases, to meaningful collective bargaining. A large number, if not a majority, of those workers who took strike action in 2022 were migrants and black and minority ethnic workers. And in January 2022, I was proud to stand on a picket line in London, at the East London Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel, with cleaners, hospital porters, members of Unite, employed by the outsourcing specialist Serco, and they were demanding not only a pay rise, but that their contracts should be brought in-house, and the contract with the outsourcing facilities company Serco should be terminated. We're very pleased to see that they were successful in that strike, and Bart's Health Authority terminated their outsourced contract with Serco, brought those workers in-house, and that's the significant way forward that I believe we need to proceed for all of these workers who are so essential, so key to the safety that we all require using public services. But at the same time, there were strikes by workers beginning in other hospitals against my team and other outsourcing specialists. We saw strikes across the railway network by cleaners working for Savest, for Churchill's, and for dozens of other private outsourced cleaning companies. And the fact is that after a year, more than a year, of these workers striking to be treated as not as second-class citizens, but as workers with rights and collective bargaining and direct employment rights in the workplace, we have not managed to shift the dial. We have made some small incremental improvements. We have won a few terminations of outsourcing contracts, but the fact is that on the whole, the workers who keep our public services safe are still being treated as second-class citizens today, and we do not give them the respect or the pay or the conditions that they deserve. On the 21st of June last year, my union began coordinated strike action in a national strike, a national rail dispute with Network Rail and 14 train companies alongside London Underground workers who were opposing threats to their jobs, their pensions and their pay. And for me, one of the most moving moments of that entire summer was organising a mass rally of striking railway workers outside King's Cross railway station in London, when we saw marching towards us down the Euston Road with their trade union banners flying a huge group of NHS leaders who travelled across London to show their solidarity with their sisters and brothers in the royal industry. And that is exactly what we need to deliver back to them today. By the end of 2022, a second wave of coordinated strike action by civil servants, members of the PCS union, and for the first time in its history by the Royal College of Nursing in England and Wales, meant that the number of working days lost to strike action in Britain totalled 843,000 in 1 month, the month of December alone. The total number of working days lost to strike action between June and December 2022 was 2.5 million, the highest sustained level of strike action in Britain since 1989. And continuing into the spring of this year, we've seen in Britain and Northern Ireland the number of working days lost to strike action increase, and strike action by teachers, members of the NEU, and health service staff, including ambulance staff, members of Unison, GMB and Unite, physiotherapists and junior doctors, members of the BMA. Opinion polls continue to record sustained public support for striking workers and their unions as monopoly energy and utility companies continue to pass price rises on to consumers, transferring the government shareholder dividends, political response, shuffling more time into tax havens. Meanwhile, the Tory government has been busy raising taxes on working people through increases in national insurance and increases in tax thresholds. So the solidarity of the workers' movement as a whole is clearly needed in this context. We are facing an intractable, powerful, but deeply unpopular enemy in the current Tory government. We need a united front of trade unions to give voice and expression to the even more powerful voice of the working class. No one else is going to do it for us, certainly not some of the current political leadership of the opposition. We need a united front of NHS staff, of outsourced workers, of rail workers, teachers, civil servants, standing alongside doctors and radiologists. It's unfortunate that the response of the leaders of some of the health unions has been to turn their backs on trade union solidarity and actually to ask trade unionists not to support picket lines for nurses and in some cases ambulance staff. In my view, that is a mistake, and we cannot defend our NHS in silos. The NHS was born out of the miners' unions in South Wales, which sought to provide universal, freely accessible healthcare for an entire community in Tredegar, not limited to one occupation or one employer. And this is the enduring strength of the NHS model, and this is why the workers' movement must come here to Durham and go away and deliver the solidarity to our NHS and NHS workers that they need.
Our next speaker is someone who's been doing that over the last year or so, at least the last year or so I should say. It's someone who I know quite well, who I've been on picket lines with, been on RMT picket lines with, been on UCU picket lines with, been on CWU picket lines with, etc, etc, etc. Oh, and of course the RCN, Junior Doctors and the ambulance workers picket lines. Is presently the Mayor of North of Tyne Authority. He is deemed a very successful mayor by all sides. Even his opponents actually say that he actually does such a competent job, you know, that he delivers for the actual people, and he doesn't let party issues get in the way of delivering for the actual people. He's someone who's quite proudly calls himself a socialist, and I must say, and unfortunately, has been excluded from standing in the coming the combined authority for the North East elections. He's been excluded from the Labour Party for even being able to get a stand as a Labour candidate.
Strong as a dictator.
Yes!
That being said, he is the Mayor in no time and will be for another year. And he's here as he is every year, showing his solidarity during the Durham Miners Gala. So, as I said, he is a friend of mine. So I will sort of ask if you could come up now, Jamie, and introduce you just a bit. I was very excited to give this opportunity to KONPNE, which was unexpected. And so I forgot to introduce myself. I'm actually Steve Fairfax. I'm actually chair of SHA North East. And I say I'm in the same constituency as Jamie. So, once again, thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. Big round of applause for Steve. Well, good evening, comrades. As you can see, rumours of my demise have been greatly exaggerated. In the immortal words of Elton John, I'm still standing. Thanks for inviting me, and everyone who's organised it. I am an SHA member and I've been for many years now. Tomorrow, 200,000 people will march through this city under trade union and colliery banners. And as those banners pass under the famous balcony of the County Hotel, where Callaghan and Corbyn and Crowe have all stood, you will notice one word repeated on the designs more than any other: unity. Black or white, man or woman, old or young, we all want a better future. Our part of the world, unity isn't just a nice slogan. It was an approach to working relationships that could literally save your life. When the great coalfields of Durham and Northumberland were still open, extreme physical danger was a part of everyday life for pitmen. When working underground in loud, dark, hazardous conditions, you had to rely on the men by your side for your safety, and they on you. Unity was essential for survival. And this philosophy extended beyond the pit itself and into the wider community. Trade unions became the embodiment of that bond of mutual concern, providing strength through collective bargaining and security through education and welfare provision. To my mind, there's no better practical expression of that unity and solidarity than our National Health Service. And no doubt you'll be aware that just days after Nye Bevan launched the NHS 75 years ago, the former coal miner arrived here in Durham to address the big meeting. A lot's changed in those 75 years, and there's no doubt that our public healthcare system is under immense pressure after years of underinvestment and gathering privatisation. Through the pandemic, we saw the immense value of our NHS and the incredible dedication of those amazing professionals to keep it going. Over that last couple of years, I've been sickened to see how those hailed as heroes have now been thrown to the wolves with derisory pay offers. But it's never just been about the money. When I spoke to nurses on the Freeman Hospital picket line, they told me that really it's about patient safety. So much of their anger is about a lack of organisational support and unsafe staffing levels that can sometimes have tragic results. I'm sure other distinguished speakers have and will go into detail about Tory health and social care bills and wealth extraction from the NHS. So I'll just ask, how do we rebuild this cornerstone of our welfare state? Well, for starters, we need to end the fallacy that private healthcare companies can solve these problems. And we should be deeply suspicious of any politician that's taken large sums of money from them, whatever their party. The campaign group, Every Doctor, which seeks to protect the NHS from privatisation, has taken a close look at how much MPs have accepted from private healthcare organisations or individuals linked to private healthcare organisations just since the last general election in 2019. The MP who's taken the most cash is Tory John Redwood, who has amassed a haul of almost £700,000 in gifts from Charles Stanley, investment managers with investments in global private healthcare companies. Meanwhile, Labour Party leader Keir Starmer has raked in more than £157,000.
Wow.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, almost £300,000.
Tories.
And Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting, more than £193,000.
Tory and red Tyne.
I've accepted no donations from private health firms, or in fact from any firms. I haven't been offered any, mind. Now, the idea that somehow we can harness the extra capacity in the private sector to reduce waiting lists is laughable. It's the same doctors and nurses and staff who would go from the NHS hospital to do it in the private healthcare hospital, but the NHS will still be liable if anything goes wrong. There's only one group of doctors working in the UK today, NHS doctors. The 17,500 that work privately in their spare time have been trained by the state at the cost of £8 billion. So far from the private sector coming to the rescue, the reality is that we are subsidising private sector training costs. So we're in this strange situation where the leader of the opposition will fund profits to private healthcare, but won't scrap tuition fees for NHS staff. In fact, you get charged interest on them. And you get in trouble if you stand on picket lines. But the leader of the opposition is not the Labour movement. Our trade unions are the Labour movement, and you are the Labour movement. And while we're on, let's look after our NHS staff and support their unions. The trade unions are defending not just their pay, but our public services. Doctors and nurses and physios are protecting patient care, just like the signal workers and train drivers and ticket office staff are protecting passenger safety. And I'm proud to stand with the RMT to defend our ticket office staff. And just this morning, we've been working through the Rail North Committee to convene an emergency meeting so that we can use our statutory powers to oppose this and challenge the government with legal action. Industrial disputes are about so much more than pay. I was talking to a group of teachers yesterday about the child poverty prevention programme I've introduced in schools. It's helped thousands of families and it's hailed as a model of best practice. And I asked those teachers about their jobs and what they wanted. Time, they said. Time to prepare for lessons and do our jobs properly. And professional respect. We don't want to be exam factories. My wife's a GP. And GPs are sick of the ludicrous market mechanisms getting in the way of good practice. Where it's almost impossible to recruit a doctor because you have this market mechanism encouraging people to become locums so you get no continuity in patient care. We need to implement a sustaining funding settlement that recognises the scale of the health challenges and does not rely on PFI 2.0. There's a simple way to fund our NHS. 3 words. Tax the rich. An annual wealth tax of, say, 1% of all assets, only those of over 2 million, would raise enough money to end poverty, provide free tuition, and end all NHS waiting lists. We need to reframe the discussion around health. Prevention is always better than cure. We need a national health service, not a national hospital service. And when we talk about public health, we must talk about all that feeds into it, from employment, housing, transport, access to community activities and green spaces. For example, every pound that's spent on retrofitting homes saves the NHS 42p by reducing cold and damp housing. We need a funding and evaluation model that measures health outcomes across all government spending and departments. And as Mayor, I've already started this process by instigating a wellbeing framework in my combined authority, which sits behind all our funding and investment decisions. After all, if the work we do as politicians is not improving health and the well-being of the people we serve, we shouldn't be doing it. What's the biggest driver of ill health? Once you've given up smoking, it's not your diet, it's not your exercise, it's inequality. And the 5,000 jobs that I've created in the north of Tyne are backed by our Good Work pledge that guarantees the real living wage, it guarantees diversity, it guarantees being listened to, including trade union representation, and it guarantees that you are taken seriously and you get the opportunity to retrain and turn a job into a career. And I was talking to Sir Michael Marmot about this, the legendary health researcher who came up with the concept of the status syndrome, that he says it's about this feeling of being powerless that does so much damage to people's health, their mental ill health, their physical ill health. And that's why we run employability programs that help people rebuild their confidence and take them through one-to-one coaching into an area where they can earn good money and keep them away from the vicious sanctions regime. Obesity costs the North East 1.35 billion a year, and we can improve healthy lifestyles by improving our transport system. That's why I spent the last 4 years negotiating a devolution deal for the North East. To get that 4.3 billion quid, I had to negotiate with Tories and Lib Dems and Labour people and independents. But that's what you do if you want to build a better world. And if I'm re-elected as Mayor, we'll see public transport back in public controls, guards on the trains, and late-night hospitality workers able to get home safely. And this will be a total transport network that will integrate buses, that will integrate the metro, integrate the heavy rail system, establish a car club so people don't have to own a car if they want to go away for the weekend or pick up something massive from IKEA. And it will integrate with active travel, so you'll have safe and secure bike parking at all public transport interfaces. It will increase the ridership by a factor of 2 to get more money into it, and it will be entirely under public control. Ultimately, it's about making sure we all have freedom of movement, not just the rich, and I will make travel free for everybody under 18. And I'm a trade unionist for the same reason I became Mayor. I believe Britain should be run in the interest of the people who do the work, and that compassion extends to carers and those unable to work, and those who've retired after a lifetime of work. The irony is that the day that London Labour HQ blocked me and took away the freedom from Labour members to choose their own candidate is that very morning I was on a picket line with the PCS civil servants at Longbenton Tax Office backing workers in struggle. How often do you see a politician in power? Not in opposition, I'm in power. Backing workers in struggle. There is no final victory, just as there is no final defeat. But I sense a change in politics. There's a shift in the ground beneath us. People have had enough of broken promises, enough of politicians appeasing billionaires, enough of culture wars pitting worker against worker, and they are looking for hope. As the great Nye Bevan put it, the NHS will last as long as there are folk left with the faith to fight for it. Well, I'm keeping the faith, and I'm up for the fight. Shy Burns getting out. Solidarity!
So, Allyson, if you'd like to come.
Can you all hear me? Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's a great privilege and honour to be here, really. And I'm very moved by all the talks and speeches so far. And it's not an easy time, as you know. So what I thought I'd do is take you on a little tour of what's really been happening to the NHS, so you know the enormity of the task that lies ahead in restoring it and reinstating it. Because at the moment, the only thing that holds the NHS together is people's belief in it, and the staff, the patients and the public. The parliamentarians, our MPs, have largely, apart from people like Mary, washed their hands completely of the NHS, and I'll explain why. But I thought I'd just start with a little story, which is last week I spoke to 2 eye surgeons who are very committed to the NHS. And they were telling me what you may know already, that half of all cataract surgery is now being done in the for-profit private sector. Now, cataract surgery is high volume and low complexity, but that's not the end of the eye disease. So as more and more of the surgery is being done in the private sector, the staff are already all migrating out to the private sector, and the NHS theatre lists are being closed and stopped. And that is actually affecting all the other eye conditions, glaucoma, macular degeneration, diabetic eye disease, all the other serious conditions that need real specialist input. So we're seeing a real degrading of the NHS care in order to support and prop up the private sector. So Specsavers, you all probably go to Specsavers, but little, maybe you don't, but little do you know that the community optometrists there are being paid a co-management fee, about £100, to refer directly to New Medicare, which is actually a company that's actually been bought up and partly invested in by Specsavers. So what you're seeing is the community optometrists, the big chains, it's a global chain, buying up the surgical facilities and integrate. That's what we mean when we say integration. It's private sector integration, not public. And at the same time, fragmenting and destroying what remains of the NHS. So when people go choose for their elective surgery, hips or knees or hearts, because patient choice is big on the Rishi agenda, agenda, they're basically choosing to fragment and undermine the NHS. Because what work that I've been doing with my colleague Graham in Newcastle is showing that the inequalities are growing because the private sector cherry picks, as we know, richer patients who are healthier and leaves the poorer and sick ones behind. So we're seeing an enormous expansion in the inequalities to access to treatment and care. And what these ophthalmic surgeons, eye surgeons, are saying is they're really worried about the pandemic of blindness is coming around the corner as a result of these policies. So how did we get to this position where half of all eye cataract surgery, which is one of the biggest operations, most frequent operations in the NHS, half of all hips, more than half, and knees are now being done in the private sector. How has this happened? And I'm going to take you on this story, but I'm just going to go back again to reiterate, next slide please, the principles of the NHS, which you all know because anybody in the SHA, as you've heard over and over again, the vision, which is what people believe in, a comprehensive healthcare, publicly owned, publicly funded through taxation and free at the point of delivery. Really very, very important. But the last one, equally important, is public accountability, not just through the MPs in Parliament, but to your local communities. And that's what Bevan was very, very keen on, putting that in. Now, it was never as strong as it should have been, but it was always there in a feature. So next slide. So this is what you all have seen. And this is really important, this founding duty. The duty of the Minister to provide throughout England and Wales to such extent as he considers necessary all reasonable requirements, accommodation and services. And he set out a schedule of all the services that should be provided. And by provided he meant direct provision, publicly owned, publicly controlled. Next slide. So the government now had a legal duty to provide a secure service, all these services throughout England. And that duty, as you know, was delegated through area-based bodies. Now that duty is the founding duty through which everything else flowed in the NHS. And that duty was abolished in 2012 by Andrew Lancing's Act, the Health and Social Care Act. So that duty has been gone for 10 years. And that's a very moving thing. And that's a duty that Peter Roderick and others, like myself, put into a reinstatement bill. Because after 2012, we knew that was the end of the NHS, really. It's being dismantled in front of us. And you can only get that duty back by legislating, by putting it back into an Act of Parliament. And that's what you must put pressure on your MPs throughout, whether they're Tory or Labour or whatever, throughout the country. And that's really, really important when we come up to Labour Party conference time. That reinstatement of that duty. Because that duty, of course the Minister couldn't directly provide everything, but it flowed directly through the area bodies. Now, if I overrun, you've got to stop me. It's absolutely fine. So next slide. So, we had the big internal market, which you know about, the Big Bang of 1990, which began to uncouple the responsibility for meeting the needs of the population. These area health bodies actually directly managed all the services. They planned for all the people in their community to provide the services. The purchaser-provider split, as it was known, uncoupled services and set them up as corporate bodies, so hospital trusts, community trusts. And that began the process and introduced what was called the internal market. So it introduced the bureaucracy of a market, pricing and tariffs. There'd never been such a thing in the NHS before until 1990 under Kenneth Clarke. Put the slide back, please. So it abolished the duty, and then you had the Health and Social Care Act, which is really important. That was the beginning of the end, which also made contracting virtually compulsory. So you had to go out to tender for services, and that's used up inordinate amounts of clinicians' time, nurses' time, nurse managers' time, the contracting. But it severed the link between the local area and all the residents in that area and their services. So where do you go when things are going wrong? Next slide. This is the awful Health and Care Act 2022 that went through. And it basically ends that principle of universal and comprehensive care. I won't go through it all. But what it does is it gives huge powers to these new providers, these providers which could be corporate providers, to decide what can be provided, where it can be provided, and to whom it can be provided. And in the bill, in the Act, that is known as provider discretions. So the providers have choice. They have the discretion to decide who gets care, what services. And it's even worse than that because they created these 42 integrated care boards. Your health authorities have gone, your primary care trust. You no longer have an area that's representing your local needs. These 42 integrated care boards are so big, they cover multiple MPs, multiple local authorities, so nobody can go in and fight for your services anymore in the local area. So local and public accountability has gone. These boards are far too big. But worse than that, these boards can actually also have the private provider sitting on them, deciding on public expenditure. So you've got enormous conflicts. If I'm sitting on Spire or Bupa, I could be tendering for a service but also deciding who's going to get that service. So huge conflicts of interest with almost no accountability in, And meanwhile, in 2012, Parliament just stood back and said, we're abdicating all responsibility, there's no duty on the Minister to secure and provide. Our parliamentarians don't care anymore. And as you heard from Jamie, they've got huge conflicts of interest, be it Labour or Conservative, in the Lords and in the Commons. So they don't care. They're only after themselves, most of them. But what you're going to see, and you're already seeing, is enormous variation is going to now take place in provision. These integrated care boards are huge, no local accountability. These foundation trusts are merging with lots of other hospitals and community services, and of course they're closing all over the country. GP surgeries are closing all over the country. Services are still continuing to close and to be cut. And of course, as the staff have told you, the quality of care is falling because not only are staff not being paid properly, but the skill mix is also being changed with a whole degrading of skill mix. Next slide. So we've had 3 decades since 1990, well really before 1990 actually, with management reforms of 80s under Thatcher as well. 3 decades of incremental marketisation and legislation, and these are the key acts of Parliament that did it, but there were many more. We've had 20 or 30 acts of Parliament, because they couldn't destroy it. The NHS was put in place with one act of Parliament, one beautiful, small, simple act of Parliament. They've needed thousands of pages in order to dismantle it, and they have not told the public what's going on. They've kept it secret. Next slide, please. So this is the final act. Next slide, please. Hello. So these providers have enormous discretions in relation to anything that can be provided under the contract. Huge freedoms and on deciding public expenditure. So keep that in your head. And of course, markets operate by risk selection. Private providers only want healthy, profitable patients and services. Next slide. This is the man that helped oversee it all, and I'm going to put him in here, Simon Stevens. He was advisor to Dobson, I'm afraid, then to Milburn, then to Blair. Milburn you all know about anyway, I don't need to tell you about him. He's one of the people who's got huge conflicts of interest. He then goes off to the States. United Health Group is one of the largest global healthcare insurance companies in the world. It provides services and insures people. And he became its president before coming back into the chief exec of the NHS to push through the rest of these reforms. He's passionate about the American healthcare system and left to be ennobled because he's a great friend of Boris Johnson, who goes up to the House of Lords and then he pushes through the 2022 Act in the Lords. This is spending. It's not just about what the money is, it's where the money is going. The NHS has always kept 3 to 4% for its first 40 years, but it provided a huge amount. You know, we've cut something like 300,000 NHS beds. So we've got democracy, an ageing population, but we've also doubled our population in 60 years. But we've managed to reduce our beds by 3/4. That's pretty extraordinary. And of course, money has kept coming in. Now there's an easy consensus. Everybody says, well, we need more money, we need more money. Of course, there's always more money is helpful. But really, as socialists, we should be asking, where is the money going and how it's being spent? Because the private sector would like more money, so would the pharmaceutical industry, because then they can just gouge out, they can take more in prices. We've got to be asking, where is it going? And I'm going to show you quickly where some of it's going. So this is what's called the great service unbundling that happened after the internal market when they put pricing in. PFI, hospitals, premises, buildings, all unbundled, put into private ownership and control. We're now leasing these premises for long-term contracts. Clinical, non-clinical, pathology, ancillary, catering, cleaning, laundry, you've heard some of the examples. Long-term care went very, very early on. Mental health beds, most of them are now, half of them are in the private for-profit sector. Ophthalmology, dentistry, all of this round the clock, increasingly broken up and privatised, including GPs. The corporates can now come in since 2003, the big corporates, into general practitioner services. Next slide. So here are some of the things that are going on Equity investors, your pathology, your diagnostics, the things that are invisible that you never think about, your blood tests, your microbiology tests. Huge. You've got all these companies coming in from Spain, from the US, from Germany, and they're forming public-private partnerships, so beloved of the Labour-Blair government. But of course they're equity investors, and equity investors want returns on their capital. They're not there because they love patients, they're there because they need to make returns. That's their primary duty to their shareholders. Never forget that. Their primary duty is not to the public, unlike NHS, it's to shareholders. So you've got all these new equity investors gouging out, but of course you've also got a reduction in some of the kinds of services and an increase in the price, just like pharmaceuticals and drugs. Next slide. Cinven, another one that you know, UK-based equity firm with 37 billion investment, owns the Synlab again, revenues of 1.9 billion. Next slide. Health Services Laboratories, Australian multinational, second largest after Synlab. They're all in there, but they're invisible. You don't know what's going on. The same is going on in radiology, right across the radiotherapy, diagnostics. Next slide. Mental health. This is really tragic because everybody knows it's impossible, hard to get a mental health bed. People have to travel hundreds of miles often, young people, away from their families to get that bed or service. And even then, they're not getting the care that they need for the length of time that they need it. So a quarter of the beds are provided by the private sector, but the private sector depends on the NHS for its earnings. Signet Healthcare is owned by New York Stock Exchange listed Universal Health Services with that revenue of 11.6 billion, revenue of 2020 456 million. You can see 150 services over 100 sites, contracts with 214 NHS bodies and also local authorities. So local authorities are also, as you know, in the business of contracting out like long-term care. Their moral code is we have integrity, but 9 of its sites investigated in the UK were rated inadequate. And we all know they're much more likely to use physical restraint, tie people to beds, etc., and also chemical restraints as well, drug-induced restraints. It's really shocking what's going on in mental health, but equally shocking is long-term care, which has had a much longer story. Next slide. Oh, GP surgeries, Jamie already mentioned them. Opero's part of United Health. Huge, 111 billion, they're in already. They Circle Health Group, independent health hospital operators. So they're all integrating primary health care hospital services. It's got contracts in 2020 for it's got more now, 20 GP surgeries, treatment centre in Birmingham, and it's also had permission to take over many services and buying out GPs and GP practices. And then they closed it down, they changed the skill mix completely, including GPs. Next slide. This is the local authority story of NHS story as well, of what happened to beds. More than 90% of the beds are called in the independent, but we really mean private for-profit sector, owned by the big multinationals and equity investors. That's where your money is going, and that's what we need to see. The difference between here and America is in America we can follow the money and the administrative costs, the expenditure on staffing and profits. We can't do that here. Once the money goes, we don't know what's happening. So if we're going to privatise, then at least we should have much better accountability for where that money's going. Next slide. And here you have the largest UK nursing homes. And actually we've privatised more of our long-term care facilities than America. Believe it or not, we're ahead of the game here. And it's been going on the longest. And we all know how COVID exposed the appalling conditions for staff and patients in nursing and residential care homes. Staff that were left desperately trying to cope in a sector that was 10% understaffed, 120,000 staff short. So COVID exposed a lot of failings, but this government is doing nothing to restore the capacity in the NHS, in health services, and it's continuing on its ideological mission of breaking up and privatising. last slide, I think. This is just a bit about 4 seasons, next slide. So, I'm going to end with this, but I'm going to say, I think it's really important that the campaigns that you do are so vitally important, and to also get the young people on board, because one of the big problems is when the nurses and doctors leave with these huge debts, you know, to repay, and interest rising now at 7 or 8%, they don't feel the way that I did. My generation feels that we wanted to give back because we were the generation that had free higher education, free training thanks to the public. And so the NHS was something we felt really passionate about, and we wanted to give back. Increasingly, I'm hearing about doctors and nurses who are doing 2 jobs, NHS and private sector. But of course, as Jamie has said, once you put the same staff in both, and the inequalities will grow. But that's also partly because of the whole problem of these student debts, loans that they're being left with, which can be as up to $250,000, as one of them was showing you. So it's really vital that we get our NHS back. That needs reform across the board. It needs legislation to reinstate the duty so that Parliament is once more telling the government and calling it to account for us, and that we can call it to account. But also we need legislation. Really, really need that. But we also need to tackle the crisis in higher education, student loans, student fees. This is systematic, this destruction, whether it be rail or water or transport or whatever. This is an ideological push to break up and destroy all of our public services. And of course, the Public Order Bill will now make this much more difficult, our protests and campaigns, but it's really important, even more important, that we get out there and protest and campaign for what we want. So don't lose hope, we've got to keep fighting, and it's really wonderful to see you all, and thank you very much for inviting me tonight. It's a great honour and privilege, and I'll come anytime to speak. Okay.
Thank you, Allyson, for that very comprehensive depiction of what we're actually facing now and what actually needs to be done. So, on to Jude.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak tonight. Keep Our NHS Public was established in 2005 as a national campaign group to oppose the ongoing privatisation of the NHS, and they've also fought really hard in 2012 to oppose the Health and Social Care Act that Allyson spoke about. Unfortunately, as she said, the Act of Conservative Parliament was passed by, we've got to remember, it was the KONPNE government, it was the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. It couldn't have passed without the support of the Liberal Democrats. And it brought in the compulsory tendering process in the NHS. Our organisation is the North East branch, KONPNE North East, and we cover Northumberland, Tyne and Durham. We have about 700 members on our mailing list, but a lot of other people follow us on social media. And we're a voluntary group of people who care about the NHS, and some of our most active members are serving and retired NHS staff. We're not affiliated to any political party, but we work cooperatively with many other organisations who share our views, most notably the Socialist Health Association, People's Assembly North East, and We Own It. And we've had a particularly busy week this week with the 75th anniversary celebrations. On Saturday, we marched in Leeds with Leeds KONPNE and all their supporters. On Wednesday, we supported Sunderland and District KONPNE at their celebrations. You may have seen some coverage in the Evening Chronicle. There was a sand sculpture on Seaburn Beach, and they also had a tea party at Sunderland Minster. On Thursday, I spoke on behalf of KONPNE North East to Gateshead Labour Women's Zoom meeting. Tonight we're here, and tomorrow we share a stall with health campaigns together at the gala. And we'll be asking people to fill in birthday cards for MPs. This is an initiative that's part of the We Own It campaign, and we would like to ask people to do that as well tonight. There's a table at the back, and it's basically to sign the card, and it goes to your MP, and it's pointing out that only the NHS can fix the waiting list crisis, and if our MPs invest in it and not in private profits. So that's that campaign. Then throughout July and August, we're hosting an exhibition called Threads of Survival, and it's in the tradition of documenting important historical events in quilts and textiles. I think it links in with the sort of Miners Gala with the beautiful banners that we have at the gala. But this is going to be at Tyne metro station. This was an initiative that was started by 999 Call for the NHS, and 160 people, I think it is, who've produced quilts and other textile art relating to the COVID pandemic. It's about their own experiences of COVID. So if you pick up a leaflet for that as well. But I just briefly want to go through what is our main aim of our campaign, which is to see a return to a fully funded, universal, publicly owned, publicly provided national health service free at the point of use. And I'll try not to replicate too much of what Allyson was talking about, because obviously I realise there's a lot of crossover there. But there's 6 points in that sentence that I've just read out. The first one, a lot of people do still think that we have all of those things. We don't fully have any of those 6 things that I've just said. Fully funded, I don't need to say very much about that. We know that the NHS is drastically underfunded, and we know that there are huge problems with staff not getting pay rises with all the strike action we've had. We've all been educated about that. And obviously, if it's not fully funded, then low pay leads to all sorts of problems with recruitment and retention of staff. So we well know that it's not fully funded. Universal healthcare system, well, it was universal until 2015, and at that point it was decided that people who were not ordinarily resident in the UK would be given a health surcharge, and overseas visitors pay 150% of the cost of their hospital treatment. But the concern is the impact that that has on migrants and migrant charging. In 2017, they decided that patients had to pay up front for their health treatment, and if they couldn't pay, then they'd just be refused treatment. And Patients Not Passports, another organisation that we're linked with, have examples of people who have died after the denial of treatment for heart failure, withholding of chemotherapy, and breast cancer treatment. And we also, during the Windrush scandal, people who paid taxes for decades in this country being refused cancer treatment. And the other worry is that hospital trusts are becoming accustomed to refusing treatment, very much like would happen in America, where treatment would just be refused if you couldn't pay. The other problem with migrant charging is it means that all NHS treatment has been fully costed and a payment system is in place, so it's ready for a complete switch over to a paying system. The third point is about public ownership, and as Allyson talked about, the main point I was going to make here was about PFI funding. We know it was started by John Major and then continued by Blair and Brown. The Guardian reported that in 2021, NHS trusts spent close to £500 million on interest charges for PFI, and that's just for 1 year, remember, and that is the equivalent to the cost of employing 15,000 nurses. And there's 101 NHS trusts who are committed to £50 billion worth of future payments. So we haven't seen the end of it yet. Publicly provided, well, Alyson's given us a very clear view of all the different companies that are involved now in the NHS, but I was just going to briefly talk about the admin costs, because setting aside the whole ethics of whether you should be making profits out of ill health, if we just look at efficiency, We know that in the 1980s, 95% of the NHS income was being spent on patient care and only 5% on administration. By 2010, after 25 years of businesses being involved, that had risen to 14%. And the administration costs now will be far greater. It's very difficult to find out a percentage. That's not advertised widely. But we know that because with the market there's all sorts of transaction costs, advertising, negotiating, contracting, invoicing, billing, auditing, monitoring contracts, collecting information, resolving disputes both in the courts and out. And you may remember the Richard Branson suing the NHS for having a contract that wasn't renewed. So we do know that this happens, and that was several years ago now. So we've got this huge bureaucracy going on, and we do know that the admin costs in the US healthcare system are estimated to be about 30%. So all that money wasted that should actually be going on patient care. And that's before they are taking money out for private contractors are taking profit out of the NHS as well. And don't forget, all these companies use the NHS logo, so as Allyson was saying, it's all very hidden. We don't know which services are actually being run by private companies. So last year the NHS spent £83 million on management consultants, which is enough to fund 14,000 hip replacements. And 21 million of that was paid to 7 firms, including Deloitte and KPMG, who are accountancy firms, and they were given that money to draft plans to reduce waiting lists. It begs the question why they didn't just spend that money on reducing waiting lists. The next point is National Health Service. Well, the question is, do we have a National Health Service anymore? Because as Allyson was talking about, it's been divided, the NHS in England has been divided into 42 different integrated care systems, each with its own board, budget and ability to set its own terms and conditions for staff, and that's obviously one for trade unions to be watching out for in the future. And in the North East, I can't imagine that our staff are going to get the best deals when it comes to, if we lose the national pay agreements. And the last point was free at the point of use. Well, many people will have noticed that services such as ear syringing and podiatry, which were previously free, are now being charged for. And hospital trusts are now actively encouraging patients to go private and jump the queue for operations such as hip and knee replacements. Since the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, hospital trusts have been allowed to generate 49% of their income from private patients. Most hospitals have not been doing this previously, but the extensive waiting lists have presented a new opportunity for trusts to encourage patients to pay privately. And Northumbria Health website advertises 24 different procedures which are priced for private patients. So if you're not already involved with us, please join us, and you can sign up at the back there or take our contact details. Look out for us on social media. Please join us and help campaign for a return to the NHS as fully funded, universal, publicly owned and publicly provided national health service free at the point of use.
No. In that case, can I ask Mark, when he has a glass of water, just to come up and so yeah, thank you to everyone. Just it's actually what should have been his introduction to the conference, but
thank you very much.
he's battled his way through. So,
I must apologise to you all. I assure you, my plans were to spend an hour or so looking at the city of Durham, arriving at early, but I'm afraid it was an awful crash on the motorway that kept me delayed by 3 hours in all. But thank you all for your patience, and thank you very much, Steve and Leslie, for stepping in, and Allyson, our president, for doing such a great job in explaining what's happening. I want to make a general point first of all, and that is that this isn't the first Miners Gala that I've visited. As a young man, I used to go to Miners Galas regularly. The Miners Galas were in South Wales, in Cardiff, and they were a celebration of working class organisation and strength and culture. And the thing I liked best about them was their fiery internationalism of the South Wales miners. And so I'm so pleased now to renew my experience with Miners Galas. And you know, one of the important points to make about this is that the National Health Service, people tend to assume, was a product of one man, an Iron Bevan, who woke up one morning and discovered that it would be a damn good idea to have a National Health Service. His ideas, hugely important as he is, his ideas had come out of community organisation and struggle. These very forces, these very people that we're going to be talking to tomorrow, the people that started building the beginnings of the NHS, its rudimentary forms. So the particular example people talk about is Tredegar, which inspired Bevan. But this was happening throughout the country. People were organising themselves to protect themselves and their communities. And they were doing it through their trade union movement, through their political parties, through their campaigning organisations. And that is a sort of alliance we have to rebuild in order to defend the NHS. Just as it was built that way, that is the way it is going to be defended, by building those broad alliances. So I think it's great that we have people from Keep Our NHS Public as part of our broad coalition, that we have our trade unions as part of it, that we have brilliant intellectual academics who incidentally also get victimised from time to time for their principal positions. It's not just Jamie who gets picked on. You know, anybody who stands out against this powerful system sticks their heads above the parapet is at risk. And well done to everybody, every one of our comrades who is so principled and who fights the corner of public services. I'd like to make some comments to you about how the SHA is, in a sense, different from some of the other health campaigns, in that we have broadly the same objectives, but we've got a slightly different mechanism of delivery on those. And I don't know if we can move on a bit. So. Okay, so one of the mechanisms we obviously have is being an affiliate of the Labour Party, and we didn't start off by being an affiliate. In 1930, the Socialist Health Association was set up as an independent organisation. It was a Socialist Medical Association then, partly inspired by German socialists and discussions, international discussions, amongst medics mainly about the need to have an effective health system. And in 31, the Socialist Medical Association affiliated to the Labour Party, and it was a way of trying to drive the politics forward of winning a national health service. So what we've been doing is we've been trying to work on the Labour Party over these years. And this has been a difficult relationship, to be quite honest with you. It's been a relationship whereby even, you know, we know that Bevan resigned from the Labour from the Labour front bench over the issue of prescription charges and dental charges. It was dental charges, wasn't it? It was prescription charges that came in later. So the SHA has always had, should we say, we describe ourselves as critical friends of Labour. So while we believe that a Labour government is really important, we think it's really also key that we have a strong say inside the Labour Party, and we put considerable pressure on inside the Labour Party to make sure that the principles of behind the NHS are retained. So a lot of us are really quite concerned about some of the most recent statements coming from the Labour front bench, which suggests that there is some, should we be diplomatic, says there's some confusion about the NHS we want to defend. And we as part of the SHA, are pushing back inside the Labour Party and saying, really, this is not an adequate response to the attacks on the NHS that we've had from the Tory governments. And in fact, there is a process of marketisation and corporate capture that's going on inside the NHS. That is to say, the commissioning structures are being taken over and not being used for the benefit of the people, but for the benefit of corporate profits. And that is really a very important thing for people to understand. The system is being corrupted from within. The engine of the system is being taken over by some of the corporate sector. And that's something which is sometimes quite difficult to explain to people, because people can see that their ambulances are no longer NHS ambulances, or they can see that that so many, if you go and get your eyes tested, or I was recently diagnosed as needing cataract treatment, and I was amazed to be pushed into the hands of private corporations delivering cataract treatment. So there is a process that's going on here. And we think it's really important to push back on that, and push back inside the Labour Party as well. And that gets us to this slide quite nicely. And you might be aware that as socialist societies, we get to have a say on Labour's NEC. And that's the top Labour Party body, which makes crucial decisions. I guess they made the decision about Jeremy Corbyn, and they made the decision about Jamie, and they will make a number of other decisions about who is appropriate to stand for various offices. And the person that we have at the moment representing us on the Socialist Society is a man, James Asa, who goes along with every decision that is made by the national leadership, and he endorses everything in our name. So when it's decided that local members of a constituency Labour Party should not be able to choose certain MPs, or shouldn't be able to choose even certain mayors, maybe, for their shortlist, this is the body that represents us, and he rubber stamps it on our name. So this year we're standing somebody against him, and it is Rathi, who has volunteered to stand in election against him. So we're determined we want to take the fight into the Labour Party. We're not, as an affiliate of the Labour Party, we are not some sort of neutral body. We actually feel quite passionately and engaged. We want to see strong advocates of the NHS in leading positions inside the party. So we're using the positions we have to challenge. So if you're a member of any of those socialist societies, then do speak to them and ask them to back Rathi, who's standing in election for the NEC. And let me see, can we whiz backwards a bit? Because in a sense we're going slightly backwards here. So can you go back to, okay, if you go, so these videos, they don't play.
The video won't, the audio won't be too loud enough. We can try again.
But even if they're subtitled.
There was people along
University for between 5 and 6 years. And rack up bills somewhere between 80 to 100,000 pounds.
It will be when I get salary. It's my debt going up, but my pay is going up to match that.
Of course, if you were offering on £25 an hour for a very senior doctor who's still not a junior doctor with 10 years of experience, these are the surgeons who are operating on your brain, delivering a child. aside for you restarting your card, and they're being paid £14 to £25 an hour. With inflation as high as it is, most of these students will actually end up paying back somewhere in the region of £250,000 of that debt. That says a lot about what condition our workforce currently is in.
Okay, so that's an illustration about how we're trying to shift the SHA from being an organisation which observes what's going on to being a campaigning organisation. So we're commissioning the production of these little mini videos, and they're for use in social media. This is one that was filmed at the time of a big BMA demonstration, and there we've got one with Zara. We've got, what we're trying to do is we're trying to, in a sense, get ourselves the modern mechanism for influencing politics more effectively than we have in the past. So we're beginning to employ people to help to deliver that message by social media, through every method we can. And those methods will include, as I said, putting pressure on the fight inside the Labour Party, putting a pressure on by backing people in mass movements, standing alongside trade unions as they fight. And you know, I must admit, it's very disappointing that the Labour leadership has told their front bench that they don't want them to appear on any picket lines. I don't think that's right. I think we should be standing alongside people on picket lines, and we should be supporting people wholeheartedly. And one of the interesting examples that we had of that was one of the professors in Oxford had done a study about life expectancy. And life expectancy obviously varies enormously within communities, and the areas with the best life expectancy tended to be the areas with the strongest commitment to equality of pay and of income and so on. And those were the areas with the strongest level of trade union membership and participation. And so one of the things that I say to people sometimes, I say, if you want to be healthy, if you want to live long, join the trade union, right? I mean, the normal advice is go jogging, eat high fibre cornflakes, but I say to people, join a trade union, get organised, drive up the living standards inside your own community, inside amongst your workmates. That is really key message. And you know, we've seen report after report from Marmot about the dire impacts of inequality on people's healthy life expectancy and indeed their life expectancy. Now, we've seen now for the first time the huge improvements in life expectancy actually plateauing and now going backwards with some groups in the population. So for the first time ever, it's possible that your son or your daughter will die sooner than you will, because life expectancy now for the first time since the Second World War is going backwards in places. So that's the seriousness of the situation. So the SHA is absolutely committed to go all out to fight on this issue. Please join us, and we commit to work as a broadest campaign with everybody, but we also commit to challenging the Labour Party when the Labour Party makes mistakes.